Thank you for the introduction. Now, this paper focuses on the effects of welded joint defects, multiple welded joint defects in a welded joint, which is a part of research that has been going on for quite a while. In this specific case, we decided to combine the experimental and numerical approaches with fracture mechanics applications, namely failure assessment diagrams, by assuming the presence of cracks in undercut defects in order to see which critical crack lengths would be obtained for two different cases of welded joint defects. So this analysis was, like I said, based on the previous work, and it represented the next step to see how the application of fracture mechanics parameter what kind of agreement it would show with the experimental and the numerical results that were previously obtained, and also to demonstrate a somewhat simple way of analyzing crack behavior of welded joints with multiple defects by using failure assessment diagrams, which will be discussed in a little bit more detail in the following slides. So first, we needed to determine the mechanical tensile properties of these specimens, which belong to two groups, both which had undercuts and vertical misalignment as the defects. And the difference was, if I remember correctly, one had incomplete root penetration and the other one did not, but that is not important here. So in order to obtain the mechanical tensile properties, the yield stress and tensile strength, of course, experiments needed to be performed first. And based on these experiments, these values were obtained. Here you can see the examples of diagrams for the specimens from both groups on the left and the right, the left one being the third group and the right one being the fourth group. And here you can also see in the table the values that were determined based on the previous diagrams and later adopted. And here you can also see the graphical representations of these welded joints with all of the defects from the third and the fourth group. And this was our point of interest. Here you can see the undercuts with different dimensions, which were accurately determined and will also used in the later analysis. Now, a little bit about the failure assessment diagram procedure that was used in this case. In order to obtain the failure assessment diagrams, we worked in accordance with the standard BS 7910, specifically the one that uses the so-called option 2, which refers to the type of the limit curve that is used for the diagram itself. And in order to construct a failure analysis diagram, two parameters need to be determined. One is the ratio of the stress in the specimens versus critical stress value, which is drawn on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, we have the ratio between the stress intensity factor and fracture toughness, or the critical stress intensity factor for our given material. And here you can also see some of the basic formulas behind the whole procedure. These formulas here refer to the limit curve. Everything that is inside the limit curve is considered safe, and everything outside of it is considered that it will fail. If this is the ratio of stress intensity factors, and if it exceeds the value of 1, or if your point on the diagram falls somewhere here, it means you will have brittle fracture, and the closer you are to the lower right corner, then you will have failure due to stresses exceeding their critical values, which is, in our case, a more favorable scenario with plastic collapse. And you can also see the formulas, the square, they represent the actual values on both of the axes, what I was just mentioning before. So after a bit of theoretical background, the cracks were assumed to be 12 millimeters wide because that was the width of the specimen that was used. And their dimensions were based on the ones I had previously shown you. For the depth, 1.2 millimeters for the third group and 0.8 millimeters for the fourth group. Now, this procedure also requires the representative stress value, which was adjusted to the adjusted value that depends on the stress in the vicinity of the crack tip. And these were determined to be 287 megapascals for the third group and 270 for the fourth group. And they were also included in these calculations. And then using these values, we were able to determine the stress and stress intensity factor ratio. And then they will be included in the formulas with the crack lengths, which started here with these values that we would gradually increase. I just forgot to mention one thing. This would be the initial crack length, and then as it increases, both of these values on the axis increase, and this point, the intersection here, would be considered the critical crack length. So for our results, also I forgot to mention, sorry, one more thing. This was one of the examples with another defect from the same welded joint. From our previous research, I just used it here to illustrate at which point a critical crack length is actually reached, because that was not what happened in our cases with this undercut. As you can see, even with the variations in the crack length, it remained in the safe zone in both cases. And also, it's better to go back to this slide. You can see that the values of the x-axis were closer to their critical value, which suggests that even if these cracks did reach their critical length, the failure would be more on the plastic collapse side, so it would be the less bad scenario, so to speak. Of course, what's the most important here is, like I already pointed out, is that none of these defects would cause critical crack length, would reach the critical crack length or cause any of the failures. And which is what we expected, because this was also the behavior that was obtained during the actual experiments. In some cases, cracks would start to form in this exact location, but because of the geometry and the asymmetry, the whole specimens would deform in irregular ways and eventually even cause compressive stresses, and the stress concentration would simply shift to a different defect and cause it to fail elsewhere. Of course, this was just one of the examples. There were actual defects that would cause failure, but there are a lot of more questions about this. For example, with these specimens, because they are very asymmetrical, there is a huge difference if you fix one side during the experiment and apply tension to the other, or if you do it the other way around. You can get very different results. And these undercuts, which weren't critical in this case, could become if we turn them upside down, so to speak. So the idea here was just to more or less briefly present this method. I forgot to mention it was done by one of our authors, Dorin, Radu, using CrackWise software. So we have papers in which the whole procedure is a lot more detailed, but I cannot really go into that now because of the time limitations. And of course, this methodology can be applied, like I said, to different weld defect combinations and also to different defects. And we can also consider different types of cracks. In this case, we had a edge type crack, but you can also have penny shaped cracks, surface cracks, or there is a lot of options that can be, different options that can be explored. And when combining it with the experiments, you can also use it for different materials and of course, different welded joint geometries. We also believe that this approach will be pretty useful as another form of validation for experimental or numerical results that we will one day obtain when we start investigating the fatigue behavior of these specimens, which will hopefully be in the near future. So thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, please.